Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see everyone here today. My name is Michael Bardi. I am the program supervisor here at the Tallahassee Senior Center. I wanted to take a moment to thank you all for participating in the 16th annual Lifelong Learning Extravaganza. This year was once again an extraordinary success. We have gone from approximately 200 participants in 2003 to well over 500 participants this year. This program continues to grow thanks to you and our wonderful sponsors. In addition to our sponsors, the success of L3X is a credit to our staff, all of whom assist in some way to make this event thrive. I would like to also give a special shout out to Emily Stearns, Maureen's successor. I will be bringing up our guest speaker today, and he is here to speak about Governor LeRoy Collins. Our guest speaker is John Grandage, Assistant Director of Historical Resources at the Florida Department of State. John has worked for the Florida Department of State since 2011. During that time, he has served as historian for the Florida Memory Program, as Executive Director of the Grove Museum, and currently as Assistant Director for the Division of Historical Resources. At the Grove, John worked to complete the award-winning restoration of the Collins House, developed the interpretive plan for the museum, and served as the site's first Executive Director from 2014 to 2021. In his current role, he manages major construction and museum development projects, as well as public relations for the Division of Historical Resources. Prior to joining the Florida Department of State, John taught courses in Native American, Latin American, and environmental history at Florida State University and Tallahassee Community College while in graduate school. Please give a warm welcome to John Grandage.
Hello, everyone. How are you doing today? It's wonderful to look out in a crowd like this and see so many people that I know. And even though you know me and may have heard me speak, you came anyway. Just fantastic. And I really want to thank the Senior Center and the Senior Center Foundation for encouraging lifelong learning in this community. And so many of you who participate, you know how it benefits you. But I suspect you also know how it benefits your friends and now how it also benefits your families. So could we give a round of applause to the Senior Center for all the work they do? And in my time with the Department of State, I've had the opportunity to do a lot of programming with the Senior Center. And I see some people, such as Maureen and Susan and others, who I've had the pleasure of working with over the years. So it's a really great thing for me to be here. And I love this space in particular. Here we are in a historic building, an armory that was built during the years of the Great Depression. And it serves the community now in a new way and in many different ways for many different people. So that's such a fabulous example of how historic buildings continue to provide value to the communities. And Tallahassee has many of these examples, including the Grove Museum, which I'll talk about here in a minute. So thank you all for being here. And those of you who know me or have been in courses with me, I've had the chance to teach also for the OLLI program for a number of years, and hopefully going to pick that back up again. Took a little bit of a hiatus. We did some courses for OLLI during COVID, and that was interesting because they were virtual. And we had Zoom OLLI, which was kind of a new experience for everyone. But of course, we're back to doing many things in person, and we're here today all together. So really quickly, if you are not familiar with the Grove Museum, so the Grove Museum is managed by the Florida Department of State, and that's, as Mike mentioned, that's who I've worked for since 2011. The Grove Museum is located quite close to where we are today. In fact, it is probably a quarter of a mile south of here, if we walked out the door here and went over to Adams Street, we'd run right into the northern part of the property. So that property today is about 10.5 acres of land, right in the middle of Tallahassee. We have a tremendous historic house on the property known as the Collins house, which I'll talk a little bit more about. That is one of the oldest residential buildings in this area that is still standing today. We know it was built in the late 1830s. We believe that the material used to build the house, bricks, were made just not far from where we're sitting today. In fact, we're closer to the brickyard that furnished that material today than we would be if we were standing in the house. So if you walked out here and you made your way towards Lake Ella, you're heading towards a historic body of water known as Bull Pond in the period around the Civil War. In that area were all the ingredients you needed to make brick. Water, you have nice eroding hillside here, clay, and the aggregate material they would have brought in. The men who dug those clay out of the ground and made those bricks by hand were enslaved people who were owned by Richard Keith Call, the original owner of the Grove property. We know a lot about their history as well. And so here we are in a place that is positioned geographically very close to the source of the material that constructed that Collins house. Also, within that property, we have the Call and Collins family cemetery, which is a very unique thing to have in an urban environment within a historic site managed by the state. And I've had the opportunity to work there going all the way back till when I first started at Department of State. And in 2014, I was hired to develop what became the plan for the museum. And that included finishing a very lengthy restoration on the house. State of Florida had a home built in the 1830s that we were going to turn into a public museum. So converting a residence that had been private into a public museum required quite a lot of work. Among other things, we put an elevator in that building. We made restrooms accessible for the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we did a lot of work on the site to make it easier to get into the house. And so that now has been over 10 years that we completed the work on the house, and the museum opened in 2017. So if you are newer to Tallahassee, or you haven't been to the Grove, it hasn't really been open that long. And we all get that kind of excuse years right in the middle of the COVID times. So in other words, there's still time to visit. And so this is really, because it's a state-owned, state-managed facility, this is here for you all, just the same as any park in Tallahassee. And we're so lucky here in the city of Tallahassee to have such wonderful parks to be able to access. So think about the Grove as another one that you may take visitors, family, or yourselves and enjoy as much as you would like. But today, I'm going to talk kind of specifically about Governor Collins. So when Emily asked me to come and speak, she said, well, you can talk about whatever you want, which is kind of a dangerous proposition for a historian, because it becomes a question of, well, how much time do I have? Do I have all day? And she said, no. And I was glad to see you all have eaten lunch, because if I were to stand between you and lunch, that would be a bad thing to do. I would never do that, okay? So glad to see that you've all eaten. When I started to think about what could I talk about with Governor Collins, some of you probably know quite a bit about Governor Collins. I suspect there's at least a handful of people here who knew Governor Collins in his lifetime. He played such a major role, not just as a political figure in Florida history, but also as a resident of Tallahassee. After all, the library is named after Governor Collins, and I was told by people who were there when that happened that one of the reasons why the library is named for Governor Collins is because of how he lent support to that project, and that he was very adamant about the availability of a public library for the citizens of Tallahassee. He himself, being an avid student of history, a consumer of knowledge and arts and literature, and you don't need to look any further than the book collection we have of his that we have on display in the museum. And so we believe very strongly in the purpose of having a public library and of course many other things, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. So when I meet people, they say, well, oh, he's the guy the library's named for, right? And that just is such a way of just scratching the surface of the significance of Governor Collins. And I thought about the way to start. I was giving a tour at the Grove the other day, and we were talking a little bit about the 1960 Democratic National Convention. So in 1960, the Democratic National Convention, Governor Collins was the chairman of that convention. And so that, famously, this is the convention when John F. Kennedy is nominated, and then, of course, he eventually wins the presidency. And his running mate in that election was Lyndon Johnson. Now, Lyndon Johnson and Collins had just a few things in common, probably a lot not in common as well, but they were both from the South. And that was really an important part of the strategy in that election, thinking about that Kennedy was from the Northeast. He was also Catholic, and this was concerning in the context of him being elected. And well, how do we get Southern Democrats to vote for John F. Kennedy? And they thought, well, we have this Collins guy. He's done some things in Florida, but they ended up going with Lyndon Johnson, who was from Texas and had been, a very firm, strong figure in his own right politically. And so Collins is the chairman of the convention. And when they opened the convention, you may have seen it. We have a fabulous film where Governor Collins tells a story. He says, he had heard a story. He was relating a story he had heard about a father that one night had gone into his son's room to see if the boy was asleep. And he walked in very quietly, and he saw that his son was down, and he was saying a little prayer. And he was saying to himself, I really hope that I can grow up to be like my dad is someday. And the father crept out of the room. The boy didn't notice. And he walked over to his own room where he did the same thing. He kind of knelt down and did a little prayer. And he said, I really hope that I can live up to the ideals that my boy imagines me to have. And Collins opened that 1960 convention challenging the delegates there assembled to live up to many of the ideals that they had assembled there and the platform that they had assembled to push through. And so I thought about that because I think Governor Collins spent a lot of his career thinking about how to bring to fruition different things in the United States, in Florida, in Tallahassee, that had been part of the promise and the theory of the founding of the United States. And here we are, next year is 2026, believe it or not, and that will be the 250-year anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And I'm sure many of you here recall in 1976, the bicentennial, and what major efforts were undertaken during that time to think about the 200-year anniversary of those events. Some of the cultural and historical artifacts from that time continue to be important to people 50 years later. A great many parks, a great many memorials and other things that projected back in the past. And here we are approaching that 250-year milestone. And I know at Department of State, we're working on a lot of projects to help explain again, many of the reasons why history is important and why Florida plays a role in that history. Many people say, well, Florida wasn't part of the rebellion against Great Britain, and that is true. Florida was a colony of Great Britain at the time of the American Revolution, and a great bit, many of the loyal subjects to the king fled from places like South Carolina and Georgia down into Florida as the Revolutionary War heated up and increased the number of people here quite a bit in places like St. Augustine. But I feel like that's a story for another time, isn't it? So some of you may wonder, Governor Collins, how did he get to the Democratic National Convention? Kind of what are the circumstances in his career that led him to get to that point? So if you're not familiar, and some of this is well known to you all, Governor Collins was from Tallahassee. His family was in the grocery business, and so they were a middle class family. There's a family home that they owned that is not the Grove. That was his wife's family home. More on that in a minute. His family home was located off Park Avenue. And I'm happy to say today, our Division of Arts and Culture happens to use that as their offices through an arrangement with an attorney that owns the building. So that is the Collins family home there on Park Avenue, not far from, uphill from the intersection with Franklin. So Governor Collins grew up in Tallahassee at a time where the state had really yet to experience the rapid population growth that Florida experienced after World War II. It was a small town. He would have had access to people who were important people in Florida politics. He talks about in some of his writings and some of the kind of reminiscing he did on video and in his own words, that he could know justices and he could know legislators and he could know state officials. And that he became very interested in his father's business, and he initially thought he would study to be a business person, but that something kept drawing him more towards the law, more towards the legislative process, more towards service. So he decided, after going to a one-year business school and not really enjoying going into the grocery business, to pursue a career in law. Now, this was a pretty important decision for him to make. Now, because of his background, he didn't have what he needed financially in order to go to the University of Florida to go to law school. So think back to this time. This would have been in the late 1920s. Governor Collins would not have had the opportunity to go to Florida State College of Law because it did not exist. Florida State was a women's college, of course, at that time, and remained so until it was coeducational in 1947. He did not have what he needed to spend the time and the money to go to University of Florida, which I guess for a Seminole myself is good. The opportunities for law school then were directed more towards, well, what can I afford and what gets me back into a position to practice law and earn money as fast as I can. So he went to a law program at Cumberland University in Tennessee. And then he came back and he started practicing law. And this would be about the time that he marries Mary Call Collins. And Mary Call, her maiden name Mary Call Darby, she was a direct descendant of the original owner of the Grove, Richard Keith Call. More on that in a minute. So her family was from the Tallahassee area and had been here since the 1820s when Tallahassee first became the territorial capital of Florida. So Governor Collins worked as an attorney and then, decided he would run for political office. And his first successful election, he's elected to the Florida House of Representatives. He serves there a couple of terms and seeks election to the Florida Senate, to which he obtains. So by the early 1940s, Governor Collins had been elected senator. He was now Senator Collins, and he was involved in a lot of important things in those days when he was a senator. Among other things, he advocated strongly for there to be a system installed that would kind of oversee the state parks and the memorials. It was called the Board of Historic Sites and Memorials. And that was kind of anticipating the need in Florida to protect historical resources. And this had not been a very large undertaking yet in Florida, because Florida had really yet to see the massive population increase that happens in the years after the war. Now, when the population started to increase, like you see in other parts of the United States, many of the historic downtowns, the historic sites, a lot of pressure was put on those for development as new things were needed, new roads, new housing, etc. as that population dramatically increased. So Collins was in the early stages of this occurring, cognizant of the need to establish systems to protect these things. And of course, in the present time, we have such a wonderful state park system here in Florida, but it was individuals like Collins who saw the need to really organize these things effectively under state government. When World War II broke out, Collins resigned from the Florida Senate and volunteered to serve. He was, at that time, a little bit advanced in age, and so he was not put in the track to be in combat. But as a government expert, he was assigned to a team that would prepare for an eventual American occupation in either China or Japan. And so he underwent extensive language training to become an individual who may interface with the leadership in those areas, depending on what that looked like and the outcome of the war. Now, the particular program that he was a part of was never really implemented. There was a little bit of a different track taken as the war ended in the Pacific and the dust settled like how it did. But this was an interesting time. I know one of the artifacts that we have from that time of the war is Governor Collins had a small little medallion that was a pin he would wear, and he was part of a group of people called victory speakers. Maybe some of you have heard of this. So during World War II, there were people, and he was one of them, who would go to community groups and try to raise awareness for buying war bonds or to encourage rationing or talk about different ways that people on the home front could contribute. And we needed a lot of help here in Florida. We had a long coastline, right? And so along the coastal cities, people had to make sure to turn all the lights out, right? Because we didn't want those lights providing a silhouette of the ships that were going up and down the East Coast, because that was a very easy target for the German submarines that operated in the Atlantic and in the Gulf of Mexico. We know we lost a number of ships during the war because of German submarine activities. So Collins was one of the people that would go around and talk to different communities and say, well, this is what you can do to contribute to this effort. And so he is stationed primarily during the war out west, and then he eventually comes back and rejoins the Florida Senate. And in the early 1950s, a friend of Collins named Dan McCarty is elected governor. Dan McCarty dies while in office, and there's a special election that's held. Collins throws his name into this, and his primary opponent was Charlie Johns, who's another well-known figure in Florida political history, mostly known for his affiliation with an investigative committee known as the Johns Committee. Collins positioned himself really well in this election. There's a famous incident that occurs where Charlie Johns had been in cahoots with some of the newspaper reporters who were going to print a headline ahead of their televised debate suggesting that Charlie Johns had just overwhelmed the younger Governor Collins in this debate, and it was a really devastating thing. Well, that was done ahead of the debate, and Collins got wind of it and, of course, brought this up and was quite embarrassing to Charlie Johns. Now, the other problem, and this is one way that we can see how a figure like Governor Collins was a product of the time where television becomes so critical for how candidates are seen, how they choose to project a certain kind of image. He is on this televised debate with Charlie Johns, and I think objectively, if I can suggest this, he was a much handsomer man than he was. He looked younger, right? He looked prepared, and this didn't really work out. And we know Collins, from his writings and things like that he felt that the access that he had to the media folks, that was going to really benefit him, but that it had to be something where he made himself accessible. And that he spent a lot of time talking to the reporters as governor, and we have these lengthy transcripts, many of which are archived at Florida State in the Claude Pepper archives, of press conference after press conference after press conference, answering questions. So Governor Collins wins that special election. He does a really, really good job across the state. He does tremendously well here in Tallahassee. He takes office. Now, here's where Governor Collins' career really starts to intersect with the national events that are happening at that same time. So the same year that he's entering office, winning the election and then entering office in 1955, we have a pivotal moment in American history. The United States Supreme Court issues a ruling in the case known as Brown versus the Topeka, Kansas Board of Education. Now, this ruling is important in a number of ways, the most important being that it rules that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. This overruled an earlier decision by the Supreme Court, Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896 case, that had stated that separate but equal was legal. Okay, so this overturned that decision. Now, in the South, and it's not exclusive to the South, but there was a lot of opposition to implementing this ruling. How would it affect schools? How would it affect buses or public pools or other, I'll use the terminology from the ruling, places of public accommodation? So, Governor Collins was among the leaders in the South who thought, well, we would like, and this is when he first ran for governor, and he said, look, segregation's the law of Florida at the present time, and we will follow the law. And we would like to challenge this decision in the courts. But what started to set him apart was he did not feel that it should be challenged in a way that suggested that the court's ruling would be automatically deemed nullified in Florida. 1955, the Florida legislature meets in session. Now, in those days, they met every 2 years for 60 days. They did not meet every year, okay? So in the 1955 session, they come in and, among other things, they draft what is known as the interposition resolution. This resolution was intended to interpose or stand between the people of Florida and the United States Supreme Court and say, this decision by the court is null and void in Florida. We will not adhere to this. Governor Collins felt that this was a very dangerous move on the part of the legislature to simply state that decisions by the Supreme Court would not be regarded as law in the state. And he, using his powers as governor, dismissed the legislature before they could pass this resolution. Now, those of you who are very political people know that a resolution is not a law, okay? So he would not have been able to veto it. But 2 years later, in 1957, that same resolution came across his desk, and he wrote on that document, which some of you may have seen. We have it preserved in the state archives. Governor Collins took the resolution, and there's a big, open space at the bottom where he was to sign it. And he took that open space to say a few kind of choice things about how he felt about the posture that the legislature had taken in this regard. He says, not only will I not condone this, as so many have sought me to do, his words, I decry it as an evil thing whipped up by the demagogues and carried on the hot and erratic winds of passion, prejudice, and hysteria. He went on to say that he was well aware, and now I'm paraphrasing a little bit, that he wanted his statement against this to be preserved in the archives, which I always found very, very entertaining, because I worked in the archives and I got to look at it and say, well, yeah, you're right. We have it right here in the R.A. Gray building, preserved forever. He said, I want my opposition to this to be adjacent to my signature on this document. Now, Governor Collins said something else important in there. He said that the effort by the legislature to call this, quote, null and void was, in his words, anarchy and rebellion against the nation. And so he was a figure that he was putting himself in a certain position in this case. He was not the only person in the South and the only person in the Florida legislature that was willing to take this type of position. But this obviously put him at odds with people who were very much in favor of opposing the Brown decision. Some of you may recall some of the language associated with that is that the states were supposed to respond to the Brown decision and take efforts to desegregate public places of public accommodation, and the term was with all deliberate speed, all right, with all deliberate speed. Now, we're going to zoom out just a little bit here for a moment. Tallahassee plays a very important role in the civil rights movement. Now, this overlaps, of course, the actions of ordinary people in the Tallahassee area overlap with Governor Collins' time in the governor's office. And remember, he is not an ordinary Tallahassee person because he is the governor, but he is a Tallahassee person. And that these actions and the initiatives that the people here in Tallahassee took on themselves undoubtedly had an influence on how Governor Collins felt about that moment in time that was occurring. So for example, in Tallahassee, we have here a bus boycott that is organized. And it is organized in some ways chronologically to the Montgomery bus boycott and used many of the same tactics. We know that the two FAMU students, Wilhelmina Jakes and Carrie Patterson, famously refused to give up a seat at the front of the bus and move to the back of the bus. And this really sparks the Tallahassee bus boycott. Religious leaders like the Reverend C.K. Steele, for whom, of course, the bus station is named, begin to organize a community-wide boycott. There were people who offered to provide taxi services. There were people that did other things to try to still help people get around without using the city buses. So much like how the situation developed in other cities, this proved very effective, and eventually the city lifts the ban on integrated seating, and that is in part because of this success of the bus boycott. Now, Governor Collins is, of course, in office at the time, and we have a lot of his writings where he's engaging directly with Reverend Steele, with city leaders, and he's part of many of the negotiations that are going on. Now, 1960, I'm going to jump forward to 1960. In fact, in February and March of 1960, we have organized sit-in demonstrations in downtown Tallahassee. These are primarily organized by students, many of them from Florida A&M University. And much like had been done in other situations in other parts of the country, the students organize a sit-in. They go to one of the lunch counters that were in the downtown at the department stores, and they sit at the lunch counter and they say, order a Coke or order a hot dog. And of course, the proprietors instruct the staff, do not, serve them, and then people get wind of it who are opposed to this type of thing, and they come and they start to harass the people. Eventually, the police come, and the student demonstrators are arrested. They're taken to what was then the Leon County Jail, which was located in today's Cascades Park. The building's no longer there. So the students really make a fateful decision, which is that they will decide that they will remain there in the jail, and they will not accept the offer to post bail and get out. They said, we're going to stay in here. And so that becomes a really significant moment here because it begins to attract attention. So it's not just attracting attention from people here locally or people here in the state. It begins to attract national attention. And at the state archives, we're very lucky to have the papers from two of the main people involved. They were sisters, Priscilla and Patricia Stevens. They gave papers to the state archives, and we have boxes of letters they received. You might imagine that not all of them were favorable, but they received a great many letters some of whom from very important civil rights leaders. Many of us know about Jackie Robinson being a major figure in Major League Baseball, breaking the color barrier. He was also involved deeply in civil rights activism, including through a publication that he was a major part of. He was writing a letter to the students, supporting them. Martin Luther King is writing letters to the students to support them. And so it's beginning to gain a fair amount of national attention. Now, Collins is governor of Florida at the time. And I started off speaking, of course, about 1960 and how he was going to be the chairman of the Democratic Convention. So this is happening just a little bit before that in the spring. Collins, he was put in a position at this time where people from both sides of the issue were contacting him. He said he was getting phone calls at his house. And I guess in those days you could call Governor Collins, right? And people were saying to him, Governor Collins, do I need to be afraid? I'm hearing rumors, okay, that there's going to be violence, that there's going to be rioting. Do I need to lock my doors at night? What do I need to do? Seems like this is coming in to be a very dangerous situation. Collins takes the opportunity, receiving this type of information from people, to go on statewide television and statewide radio and address the people of Florida. He gives about a 35-minute speech, and you can find this recording if you're interested through the University of South Florida. We also have a copy in our records as well. And he tells a story which I think is really revealing of the times and how things had developed. He said he had, as governor, he travels and he lands at the airport, and he would get a highway patrol officer. Would pick him up and take him home. And so he's landed at the airport, and the officer is taking him back to his house one of these times. And the officer starts to tell him a story. Say, Governor, I heard the other day that there is a busload of men coming to Tallahassee with baseball bats, okay? And we think there's going to be a riot. These are African-American men, a busload coming to Tallahassee. And so Governor Collins says, well, I don't know about that, but I will find out. So he says he called the president of Florida A&M University at the time. And the president said, Governor, I have to tell you, there's some truth to this. We've had a baseball game scheduled with a school up in Alabama. And so imagine that how you all, right, are reacting. It seems absurd, but Governor Collins, in making this statewide address, said to the people of Florida, do you see where we are? Right? I have people calling me afraid of what's going to happen. The existence of a baseball game over at FAMU has now been spun into a story where there's there's men coming down with baseball bats, and they're going to riot in the streets. He said, this is a very dangerous situation. So there's a lot of different things going on at this time in 1960, right? Florida doesn't exist in a vacuum. So there's citizens who are seeing what's happening in other states, right? And there are people who are watching, okay, around the country, and whichever side they kind of fall on, they're watching this happen. And Governor Collins is also very concerned, well, what does this do to the image of Florida? How does this make us look to the rest of the country? Governor Collins, in this speech, and I really recommend that you listen to it, it gives you the full spectrum of how he approached this kind of issue. He says, well, look, I'll tell a few things, and I'll paraphrase most of what he said. He said, look, we cannot continue to believe that the Black community will accept this kind of two-class society. He said it is not a democratic point of view. It is not a Christian point of view. He himself was a man of faith. And he said, finally, it is not a realistic point of view. He went on to say that we could never stop Americans from struggling to be free, from hoping and praying that someday that the words embedded in the Declaration that all men are created equal, will be a reality and not just a distant, illusory goal. And those are kind of his words. About 10 years ago now, I had the chance to go down and spend some time at University of South Florida, where Governor Collins has a lot of his papers. And there are about 5 boxes of letters he received after that speech. Now, there are a lot of people who were upset with what he said, but there were a lot of people who felt that he had explained things in a way that had started to lay out more plainly the situation that was in front of us. During that same speech, he said, well, you know, I have a bank account at a bank downtown. And, you know, when you come in and you do business at the bank, they have coffee. And anyone can get the coffee, right? Whether it's a black customer or a white customer. And then, you know, when we go to the department stores, these private business owners, under the present law of the United States, they have the right to refuse service. That's their legal right. Governor Collins says, I don't know how they can square that right with moral, simple justice. So this speech he gives goes down in the annals of history, I suppose you could say, as the moral code speech. Now, Collins, shortly thereafter, he's at the Democratic National Convention. He leaves the office of Florida's governor, and so he's no longer governor of Florida. By 1961, we have a new governor. And I'll insert here an interesting track that his career takes in those days, which I think many of you may not know. He was approached by the National Association of Broadcasters to serve as its president. Now, I have to explain this when we give tours to school groups, that like TV didn't always exist, right? But then that in the early days of television, it was unclear what was the purpose of it. Would it have educational purposes? Would it be used for news and information? How did entertainment play into this? And we know it's become all these things, right? But that the broadcasters had gotten into a little bit of trouble. There had been some scandals regarding some game shows that had been fixed. And there was a lot of advertising on television that concerned certain people, including Governor Collins. He was very concerned about overt violence being on television, and he was very concerned with marketing tobacco products to kids. This was in 1961. And we have a video that we play at the Grove, and visitors can see it, where he's being interviewed and asked, well, what is the problem with this? And he explained it along these lines. He said, well, an adult can make their own decisions about these sorts of things, but when you market cigarettes to children and you kind of portray it as glamorous and these things, he called it, quote, a dangerous and insidious thing, in his words. He stayed in that position a little while, but not really that long, because he spoke about how he went into the job saying he was going to improve the image of broadcasting. But of course, as we know, advertising is a lot of the bottom line of broadcasting. And at some point, he was sort of, asked that, okay, I think we've done what we needed to do here. Now, Governor Collins was not done in his political career at that time. He was, in 1964, named to be the head of the Community Relations Service, and this leads to perhaps his most visible moment in the public eye in American history. The Community Relations Service, you've probably not heard of it in history. It was created by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. President Johnson, when he signs the Civil Rights Act and goes on nationwide television, he actually names Governor Collins in his speech and said, I've tapped Governor Collins of Florida to lead this service. And the service is supposed to go into communities and figure out how we might manage the implementation of this civil rights law. Because we want this to be successful, but we do not want there to be a large amount of conflict over it if we can manage that. And Governor Collins is given the mission to work with communities, work with people who are opposed on this issue, get them in the same space, and negotiate some kind of solution. So they go to hundreds of communities. The one that stands out is in Selma, Alabama in March of 1965, which I'm sure some of you know. In March, demonstrators attempting to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge are attacked by the Alabama State Police. And this is broadcast all over the country, and it's a very ugly and terrible scene. I don't need to tell you all that the Vietnam War is happening at the same time, among other things. And that this is very damaging to the image of the United States, thinking about what the United States was projecting in terms of its image around the world. So Governor Collins is sent to Selma to come up with some kind of solution to what had happened. We know from his writings and the writings of others involved that he met with the Alabama authorities, including the state police. Governor Wallace was governor of Alabama at the time. And then on the other side, he was meeting with Dr. Martin Luther King, who was, of course, one of the lead organizers of the march. And among other people involved were John Lewis, Andrew Young, and really some of the main leaders we've associated with the civil rights history in our country for a very long time. So Governor Collins is there. He's literally the main federal representative who's supposed to come up with some kind of solution to this. And as it happens, he's able to broker a deal where the march will return to the spot, the same spot where the attack happened. They will be able to kneel and hold a prayer session, but then they would turn around, not move any further, and go back to the point at which they had started and organized, which was at a church on the other side of the bridge. And the Alabama authorities agreed that they would not engage them or attack them again. When the time came, that's exactly how things went. And so Collins was responsible for brokering that behind the scenes. But if you read his writings, he says he didn't really know what was going to happen, that he had been given assurances by the various parties, but of course he did not control them, that it would be up to them to do what they said that they did. And talking or looking through the words of Dr. King, he said he wasn't quite sure what would happen either, and that he was not sure that he could control the marchers any more than perhaps the governor could control the state police. So it was a very potentially damaging situation, but it worked out that the march later, now these are days later, that a judge at the federal level lifted Governor Wallace's injunction that had banned the march. The march continued, onto the state capitol. And then the Voting Rights Act is passed later that year. This is 1965. Now, Collins doesn't fully disappear yet. In fact, he attempts to run for United States Senate in 1968. Now, by that time, we have a lot of things that are evolving and changing. Thinking about where the Vietnam War was in 1968, thinking about the political movement that had originated and how the presidential election was kind of shaking out in those years. Collins became a very unpopular candidate. And it was really related to the fact that he had been at Selma, that he had been the representative of President Johnson, and that in the years after 1965, of course, we have additional civil rights legislation passed in 1968. You have the Fair Housing Act. And of course, you have other things that are happening around that same time. He loses the election for Senate, and he comes back to Tallahassee. It's had a lot of repercussions for him personally. I've been told stories about how his barber refused to cut his hair, for example, And that's obviously a little bit humorous, but to a person, these were the types of things he dealt with, not just politically, but as a person. Now, Collins, for his part, never doubted he had done the right thing that day in Selma, Alabama. There's a photograph taken of him. It ran in the papers. It shows him walking alongside Dr. King and Andrew Young and John Lewis. And this, during that 68 election, was broadcast everywhere. This is what the attack ads of the day used against Governor Collins. But I will tell you, when we were working on the museum, and we had Governor Collins' office preserved. If you've been to the Grove and you've been down in the basement, you can see his office preserved just as he left it. That photograph, okay, the same one that was used to ultimately end his political career, he kept right to the left of his desk. I think every day there perhaps is a reminder to him that he made the right decision and that he lived with that decision, and he never regretted that decision, at least according to his writings and everything that he put out about that. So Governor Collins, later in life, some of you may know, continued to work in public service. He was a major proponent in his time in office for constitutional revision that did not occur in Florida while he was governor. That occurred in 1968, and one of the main successes that came out of that, from if Governor Collins were to be here today, was that legislative reapportionment occurred. Prior to that time, and when Governor Collins was in office, he would often speak of the fact that 17% of Florida's population elected the majority of its representatives in the legislature when he was governor. And that this really failed to adequately account for the fact that Florida had changed, that there were cities in places like Tampa and Orlando and Miami and Fort Lauderdale that had become quite populous, right? And that these were instrumental to the future of Florida. And some things I didn't talk about today, by the way, that some of you may find very interesting, is Governor Collins played a big role in the expansion of our state college system. During his time in office, there were 10 state colleges opened. He helped open the University of South Florida, and really the framework for what became University of Central Florida, but that would have been in his immediate successor's time, came to fruition. And part of that really boiled down to the experience he had that I talked about 30 minutes ago as a young man here in Tallahassee without an opportunity to effectively go local for school. He had to go to Tennessee. And he knew that Floridians would not be able to compete in the future if they could not commute to state colleges and if they could not obtain higher education so as to compete in the economic world that was changing. So while Governor Collins is mostly remembered for Selma, for how he led here during the sit-ins and what kind of role he played in relation to other local leaders, his legacy really goes far beyond that. Education, he was a very big proponent of tourism support through the state and to get people to come to Florida. He was a big proponent of traveling and speaking to business leaders in other states on the virtues of relocating their businesses to Florida. He would go on these trips in the Northeast and go to business clubs in places like Pittsburgh and Chicago and Youngstown, Ohio, and speak at length about how businesses should come to Florida because of different types of tax advantages that the state was willing to offer. So he had a very wide platform, but a lot of it is really based in his experiences that he had here growing up in a Florida that's much different than the Florida that we have today. A smaller version of state, a state that had yet to rapidly increase. And so the way that people like Governor Collins reacted to those changing times, whether it was in the realm of civil rights or in the realm of education or economic development, has really helped to shape the state that we have today, which has now become the third largest state in the country. You know, it's not long ago. We could go 100 years ago and Florida would be under 1 million people. Can you believe that? And today there's, well, we could put a ticker up there. We could have like a live ticker. Maybe we're at 23, maybe we're at 24 million. So it's such a dramatic increase in the population and sort of the needs as well of that population. So Governor Collins had an interesting perspective. Now, all that is to say that the state of Florida is so lucky to have the Collins family work to make sure that their home, which dates all the way back to the 1830s, a much different reality, a very vastly different Tallahassee than the Tallahassee of the period in which Governor Collins was involved in civil rights. You know, that was a plantation site, right? So think about how his physical presence in a place whose history was originated in a much different time might have influenced the way that he thought about the time he was in at that time. And his wife, Mary Call, she is really the main reason we have that museum. Her efforts to work on the preservation of her own home. She served on the Mount Vernon board at George Washington's home in Virginia. She lent her time and energy towards preserving the Union Bank, which I happen to be at this morning, by the way. And a great bit of the preservation legacy we have in the present is due to the work of women, and Mary Call is one of the many women who have done this kind of work. So we're very lucky to have this asset. I hope I gave you some things you didn't know, and thank you very much for your patient listening. You are a great audience, and it's so good to see you all here today. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and thank John again for a very interesting talk. Before closing, I would like to say thanks again to our sponsors, and especially to our presenting sponsor, Audiology Associates, and to have a great and safe weekend. Thank you for coming.